Hello. Welcome back to the Space Gulag. Today we'll find out what would have happened had the Sith had all the power in the galaxy while the Jedi adopted the rule of two. Before we begin this video, special thanks to our patrons, voice actors, and everyone else part of my team. Want a chance to win in our next giveaway? Watch the end of the video and I'll tell you how we can win, because the giveaway is almost over. We're almost at 50,000 subscribers! Anyways, as our story begins, I'll be redefining the parameters of the galaxy we know. The Sith had taken over the galaxy. They operated out of Coruscant, being that it warranted them the most control in the galaxy. Grand Lord of the Sith, Yoda had been leading member of the Sith Order for nearly 600 years, since the day he challenged the Grand Lord of the Sith Order and took over his place. Ever since, the Sith Council had been refilled with loyal members of the Grand Lord of the Order. The galaxy had descended into chaos and nobody was safe from the opposition and oppression of the Sith. For over a millennia, the Jedi have held out hope, and now only 2 Jedi remained. The Jedi worked hard to stay in the shadows. Throughout the time, there had been uprisings, where hundreds of Jedi fought to take down the Sith, and yet every single incursion fell short. The Jedi were weak, and they were not warriors. Yes, some of them were good, but not good enough to stand up to the warrior society of the Sith. In the Outer Rim, located in the quiet world of Ahch-To, 2 Jedi Masters meditated in silence. Jedi Master Plagueis and his student Palpatine. They were focused on the Force, letting it bind them and surround them. Ahch-To was one of the few safe worlds in the galaxy for the Jedi. The Sith, while oppressive, were able to convince citizens that reporting a Jedi would allow them to receive something of value. Truthfully, it only garnered less pain for that population. The reason Ahch-To was perfect for the 2 Jedi is that the planet masked their essence in the Force. Ahch-To was perfectly balanced in the Force. It had a powerful light, and it too had a powerful darkness. This also allowed both Palpatine and Plagueis to focus on their own essence within the Force. The biggest struggle for these 2 Jedi to confront was the idea that the galaxy was overrun by the Sith. They were 2, and the Sith Order was 10,000. Legions of warriors. While Plagueis played the role of silent leader, he was also the one that believed the Sith were unstoppable. His eager apprentice had a different feeling towards it. Palpatine believed that defeating the Sith was within their power. They just had to focus on how they could constructively do so. The 2 Jedi finished their meditation, and they walked around the gardens of their little island. The caretakers were doing what they always did, maintain the island they lived on. Plagueis stopped at the edge of the mountain and looked out. He watched the waves crash down and looked at his student, who stood silently behind him, with fluorescent robes. The wind was soft enough to chill one's body, and the silence of the crashing waves could ease the mind into absolute peace. Plagueis turned to his student and told him that as a Jedi it was their responsibility to ensure their way of life was never lost to the shadow of obscurity. Palpatine nodded his head, but as he normally did, he spoke up. He told his master that as a Jedi it was important that they stand up for what was right. Plagueis agreed with his student, but he reminded him of their place on all of this. The odds were against them in every single facet of the galaxy. They had nowhere to go, no allies, and an order of thousands of warriors ready to kill them. Palpatine nodded his head, but he stepped up in front of his master and told him that he had an idea. Palpatine was a big-picture individual. He had a lot of thought in his mind, and he considered himself to be very educated, which was actually very accurate. Palpatine started speaking fast, as if his words were trying to keep pace with the ever-so-exaggerated state of his mind. Palpatine walked around, tiptoeing on the edge of the cliff, while suggesting to his master in a rhetorical nature that if the Sith relied on their passion, then they were weak. Plagueis stood silently, listening as Palpatine continued. That through their passion they believed they were strong, no? Plagueis nodded his head. Palpatine continued, telling his master that through their supposed strength they were supposed to have power, and through said power they could only find their victory, no? Plagueis nodded his head and asked where he was going. Palpatine chuckled to himself before saying they were narcissists. Plagueis' eyes darted around, trying to connect the dots that his overly excited student was making. Palpatine turned around after catching a glimpse of 2 porgs diving into the sea below. Palpatine said that their reliance on such traits made them weak. Plagueis spoke up and said it made them warriors, much better warriors than any Jedi. Palpatine nodded his head. That's it. Plagueis stopped in his tracks and asked what he was suggesting. Palpatine smiled and told him to come along. Plagueis followed his eager student up to the top of the mountain, inside a little cavern with a water-filled Jedi logo. Palpatine stopped and turned around, and he asked if Plagueis remembered the important notes of the Jedi Code. Plagueis repeated them out from the heart. Peace, knowledge, serenity, harmony, and the Force itself. Palpatine jumped with glee, shouting excitedly, the word exactly. That was the point. Plagueis still didn't see it. He didn't understand. Palpatine turned around and walked out on the ledge and told his master that the reason the Jedi continued to fail was because they kept playing a game the Sith were good at. Not only good at, but they were winning. The House always wins, and the Sith were winning. The Jedi were strong of knowledge. They practiced serenity. They lived in harmony and in peace, whereas the Sith focused on their passion, strength, and power, making them only look for one thing only: victory. Plagueis nodded his head. He knew the lessons of the Jedi and of the Sith, but he had no idea why Palpatine was going on a tangent about either of them. Palpatine said that the Jedi were doing it wrong the entire time. Instead of focusing on their strengths, they'd been focusing on what made them weak. The Jedi tried to fight a war they could not win because they were indeed not fighters. Instead of using their incredible intellect and their harmony, they allowed themselves to become futile in the ways of the Sith. Plagueis asked what Palpatine was suggesting, as a student told him that he was suggesting forcing the Sith to fight each other. It was widely known that they liked the challenge of battle. They preferred the challenge of beating someone else. Plagueis looked at his student, and Palpatine said that they would go to the local Sith outpost on Ryloth, not as enemies, but as allies. Plagueis almost fell over hearing the suggestion, but Palpatine continued. They would don Sith robes, and then they would force a mask onto their eyes in a golden tint. From there, they could move forward and get inside of the Sith ranks. Plagueis was at an all-time high confusion, almost assuming that Palpatine was suggesting joining the Sith. Palpatine turned and came back in from the ledge, and then with eyes full of excitement, he said they would turn that outpost against another outpost of the Sith. Plagueis shook his head, saying it would never work. There were far too many Sith, and they would notice that he wasn't one of them. The operation was far too deadly. They would be better off waiting it out and hoping that the Sith do something else. Palpatine couldn't believe this. He couldn't believe his ears. He knew his master was rather conservative when it came to leaving Ahch-To. It had been that way for several decades with Jedi, but Palpatine couldn't stand it anymore. Truthfully, Palpatine was a bit more connected to the Force than Plagueis was, and he was able to feel all the pain that people across the galaxy faced under the oppression of the Sith. It sickened his stomach and it hurt him physically. The legacy of the Jedi had amounted to total failure, and it was because of this mindset. The Sith ruled over the galaxy, people suffered, and it was their inaction that allowed this suffering to continue. Palpatine also couldn't live with it anymore. The weight of the pain that people went through was too much for him to bear. He could feel villages burn on Shili, he could hear children cry on Anaxis, he could smell the burning ember of civilizations on Alderaan. The galaxy was a cruel, cruel place, and yet Palpatine seemed to be the only one in the galaxy who saw something better in it. Instead of believing the galaxy was only destined for pain and destruction, he believed that it could be brought back to a time before the Sith took over the galaxy. It had been so long, and the galaxy had forgotten what life was like without oppression, what it was like when someone could stand up to the bad people. But no one could stand up to the Sith, and no one could fight, and the fight itself felt lost. As the night started to crest over the horizon, Plagueis told Palpatine that right now, it was their only goal to keep the legacy of the Jedi alive. They had no weapon against the Sith, and they couldn't maintain any fight without endangering the lives of millions, maybe even billions. Palpatine felt so disheartened hearing this from his master as he turned away and walked away. Palpatine knew it wasn't Plagueis' fault. When Plagueis was just a student, he once had the same aspirations, but when his master acted upon their hope for change, his master was killed by the Sith. Plagueis' only rule to himself was to not allow the Jedi to die, and most importantly ensure that his student lived long enough to have a prosperous life as a Jedi. But that was never possible with someone like Palpatine. A normal student who didn't have a strong connection to the Force wouldn't be as eager to jump out into the galaxy and try and fight, because they wouldn't be able to feel as much as Palpatine did. While the galaxy was primarily led by the Sith and ruled by them, the way they kept their power was through various outposts across the galaxy. Sure, the temple on Coruscant was their main focus of operation, but the Sith surprisingly knew better than to keep all 10,000 isolated on Coruscant at the same time. Of course, the entire Order of Sith would be present once a planetary rotation, but for the majority of a year, they weren't there. Palpatine walked back out to the ledge and watched as the sun disappeared and looked at the hollow moons sitting above Ahch-To. These moons were invisible. Their rotation had them hollow, but the outline of their shadow was still present enough that Palpatine could see them. He sat down on the rock at the edge of the ledge, and he looked up. He loved the beauty and serenity of Ahch-To, but as he closed his eyes for a short moment, he could feel the Force call out to him. When he opened his eyes, he looked up to the stars, and he saw the possibility of something greater. Each star was a speck of hope, and while the moons were hollow, they could still emit light. Palpatine realized that it was a matter of perception. He wouldn't die, because he knew how much he meant to Plagueis, but he also knew he couldn't die because he trusted himself to succeed. Palpatine knew that in doing this, he would upset his master if he died, but he had to try. Looking at the moon, he knew he had to. It was all about how one perceives their predicament. While maybe the moon wasn't visible, it was always there. And that meant while hope wasn't visible, it was always there. The possibility to change was something that was always there, and the light at the end of the tunnel was always something that could be attained. Palpatine leapt to his feet. He had to do it. He ran through the cave and out through the land, running down the mountain and making his way for their one vessel. An ancient ship from the times of the Old Republic, recovered before the Republic crumbled to the Sith Order. Palpatine jumped in the vessel and started up its rusty engines and powered it up. Before he left, he closed his eyes, and felt the intuition in his heart telling him the path of the Jedi was a noble one. Palpatine's eyes shot open, and he shot the ship off of the island and departed from the planet of Ahch-To. Plagueis was a bit of a heavy sleeper, and he never heard the sound of the ship taking off, and so he enjoyed the stillness and peacefulness of his own sleep. Palpatine, on the other hand, set coordinates for the first Sith outpost in the relation of his location. Palpatine headed straight for Ryloth. The planet was renowned, at least by rumor, for having one of the worst Sith outposts in the galaxy. Their people were continuously murdered, and it was because around 700 years ago, about 210 Jedi attacked the outpost. They all died, and only one Sith died. And for that one Sith death, the people of Ryloth were guaranteed 1,000 years of hardship for the Jedi's decision to act so righteously. Regardless, Palpatine flew from Ahch-To to Ryloth, and he made a discreet landing in the barren valleys on the dark side of the planet. Palpatine knew where the outpost was. It was the only place on the planet that had any power, only one allowed to operate with power. In other words, the Sith made sure that absolutely no one was allowed to have power, and so they used the only electric grid on the planet while the Twi'leks starved, froze, and overheated, depending on the time of year and the temperature. Palpatine landed during the nighttime, and so he traversed the desert in silence, with an old speeder that he had inside the ship. Palpatine made his way to just outside the Sith outpost and flashed a light to draw in one of the Sith guards. Palpatine knew what he was doing, and with a faint light to alert one of the few guards the outpost had, they left the safety of the outpost and made their way towards the shine of his flashing light. The Sith was a marauder class. He was filled with anger and disappointment. He had been getting ready for sleep. Yes, sleep on the job, before he saw the flashing. Realistically, the only thing that made him happy about this was the thought of executing a Twi'lek for disrupting him. Though when he got out, he saw nothing. Palpatine snuck around the corner and wrapped his arm around the Sith's neck, choking him slowly while covering his mouth. Palpatine had to ensure he didn't damage the robes of the Marauder. Something that was even more fortunate for Palpatine was the fact that the Sith Marauders wore helmets, so he didn't have to fake the color of his eyes. When the Sith was dead, Palpatine removed his robes and covered himself in the dark outfit of the Sith. Palpatine made his way back. His comlink went off, and someone asked him what he was doing. Palpatine told the person on the other end that he was drawn out by a Twi'lek, admitting that he gutted the Twi'lek for using a power source. The voice on the other side ended the call, and Palpatine was free to enter. As he made his way into the facility, he noticed how large it really was. From the outside it looked rather small, but from the interior it felt huge. Palpatine walked around the corridors searching for what he was looking for, and then he found it. It was a communication array. Palpatine looked around both ends of the hallway and entered. It was the early morning, not many people would be awake, not even the Sith. Palpatine walked in and locked the doors. He got to work, opening up the communication device and preparing a message. But then he heard voices. Instantly he shut down the console and he used the Force to open up a panel in the ceiling before leaping up and hiding away. Palpatine closed the doors on the panel, and just in time, two voices opened the doors and walked in. Palpatine was actually outraged. He couldn't believe the doors didn't actually lock. One of the voices looked over and said to Master Dooku that the doors were apparently locked, and that someone was apparently in here. Dooku closed his eyes and felt around the Force, before looking at the Marauder next to him and telling him that if he woke him up again for something so unimportant, then he should reconsider his place in life. Dooku turned around, demanding that the Marauder leave or be killed. Dooku stormed off, leaving the room as the Marauder shook his head, following Dooku out the exit and turning in the opposite direction of the hallway. Palpatine held his breath. He let go of it when the room was filled with silence. He opened the panel out slowly and leapt down to the ground and got back to the communication device. Palpatine's plan was coming to fruition. As he looked through the list of masters at this particular outpost, Dooku was one of the highest ranking masters present, but Sith Lord Eth Koth was the headmaster of this outpost in particular. While Palpatine didn't know Koth was an Ithorian Zabrak, he kept his mask on to conceal his identity. Palpatine sent out a message to the dozen Sith outposts located across the galaxy, including the temple on Coruscant. and addressed himself as Lord Koth, reporting that Lord Yaddle from Anaxis claimed that she was stronger than the rest of the Sith, reporting that her outpost would be able to take down the rest of the Sith. Lord Koth continued saying that he supported the idea of proving who the greatest outpost was, claiming that the last remaining outpost should be able to live within the temple on Coruscant, with its lord representing the Grand Lord of the Sith. The worst part of this is that moments after Palpatine ended the transmission, another transmission came in from halfway across the galaxy on Korriban from Lord Windu, threatening to rip Eth Koth and Yaddle apart for challenging the power of his outpost, especially since the outpost laid claim to the homeworld of the Sith. Palpatine chuckled to himself before abandoning the communication chamber and making his way back outside. While his plans seemed to be going brilliantly so far, playing off the arrogance of the Sith and their morality, he exited the temple. As Palpatine got closer to his speeder on the outside of the temple, he heard a voice call out the word Jedi. Palpatine whipped around, igniting the crimson lightsaber. It covered his mask, and he looked for the sign of the voice. The voice sheathed Palpatine's lightsaber with the Force and told him he didn't want confrontation. Palpatine asked what he wanted. The Sith Lord said his name was Dooku, and he'd been thinking about leaving the Sith. While Dooku didn't have some purified vision of the galaxy, he simply just couldn't stand his former master, Grand Lord Yoda. Dooku didn't want his power, he simply just wanted to exist in the galaxy without the Sith. Dooku hadn't ever seen a Jedi, but he'd heard about them before, and so he had concessions about them, but they weren't too deep thought. Palpatine asked Dooku what he wanted. Dooku simply just said that he wanted the reign of Yoda to fall. Palpatine asked one thing: if he felt him when he was in the communications room. Dooku told Palpatine that he was the one he contacted when he made his way back from the outskirts before even getting into the temple, let alone the communication room. And then Dooku admitted that yes, he could feel Palpatine's essence in the Force, but he led the Marauder away. Palpatine told Dooku it was up to him what he wanted to do from here on out. He had to leave the system before the Sith arrived. Dooku nodded his head, and realized that he needed to do the same and abandon the system too. The Sith would be here, and war would be upon their ranks. And truthfully, Dooku didn't feel like fighting for a war he had no voice in. He would wait and see if his master would die, but first, he needed to leave. Both Palpatine and Dooku would abandon Ryloth, and for Palpatine, he would return to Ahch-To before his master would awake. Instead of sleeping, Palpatine would make his way to the top of the mountain and begin to meditate on the platform overlooking the wondrous seas as he sat down as dawn was coming. Across the galaxy, fury exploded and chaos reigned, but not in the typical way that had done so in the past under the Sith rule. The system that the Sith set up to ensure their own longevity was failing to function for them, and the Sith began to turn on each other. Entire outposts went to war, and planets that were semi-peaceful under the Sith rule found themselves submerged into yet another chaos. Sith Lords from across the galaxy challenged other Sith Lords, and it was an absolute exposure of the failure of the Sith to have a bit of humility, or even to see the painstakingly obvious fault in their ranks. Grand Lord Yoda noticed this, and he tried to stop it, but before he could stop it, Sith Lord Plo Koon stepped into his throne room at the top of the Sith Temple on Coruscant and challenged him to a duel. Yoda was off of his game, and he was truly at a disadvantage, because he was trying to stop all the different Sith outposts from tearing themselves apart. Plo didn't stop as he marched forward, igniting his lightsaber. His outpost was from another ancient Sith world called Exegol, and they were known for complete silence. This outpost rarely communicated, and they were mostly assumed to be the largest cult mindset in the Sith. Plo's Sith outpost marched on the temple, and they swept the floor with the Sith that challenged them. It was an all-out brawl, and while Yoda tried to do damage control, Plo led his army against Yoda's and ripped them apart. While they had a numerical disadvantage, they made up for it in their element of surprise. Most of the Sith outposts that were invaded were completely blindsided. Either the messages hadn't been opened, or the Sith Lord didn't inform them and attempted to run. Regardless, thousands of Sith were dead and dying. Palpatine sat in a state of almost absolute peace when he could feel the worst of the worst tearing all of them apart. Windu killed Yaddle, Adi Gallia being slayed by Depa Billaba, who was then killed by Ki-Adi-Mundi, Yarael Poof gutting Oppo Rancice. It was a bloodbath. Windu's outpost moved from system to system trying to clean up the other challengers, and yet the only Sith that was able to recognize that it was a trap, and before he could save the Sith from imploding on themselves, he himself found himself being challenged by one of his counterparts. One of the few other lords he knew was a viable challenge. Yoda turned to see the Crimson heading towards him, and he tried his best to defend himself, igniting his weapon and leaping towards Master Plo. Their blades cascaded across the throne room at the top of the Sith temple. Plo and Yoda in a fierce battle to have control over the Sith. Firstly, Plo wanted to change the Grand Lord into Emperor, believing the name to be a poor reflection of Yoda's leadership. Plo jabbed forward, using his hulking strength to push back Yoda. Below the temple, Lord Windu arrived, and the great battle began rocking the Sith temple in the conflict. Yoda leapt up in the air and knocked Plo off his balance as he tripped backwards. Yoda jabbed down, missing Plo's left leg, as the Sith Lord swung his right boot around, kicking Yoda across the head and tossing the little green life form into an adjacent wall. Yoda looked over, and he didn't see Plo. He was missing. But as he looked around, he saw Plo engaging Sith Lord Windu. It looked as if Yoda had just secured himself a way out of the fight so that he could continue his legacy. As Plo and Windu got into a tense confrontation, a ship rose up beside the temple throne room, and out from the vessel came Yoda's last student. Yoda grinned. This was his escape. He could throw Dooku at the other two Sith Lords and escape without him. But when he caught a glimpse of Dooku, he realized that his hand was on his lightsaber. Dooku cut through the glass and struck violently at Yoda. The Grand Sith Lord fell backwards and defended himself. The throne room was desecrated, and the last 4 remaining Sith Lords in the galaxy fought each other. In the base of the temple, a battle still raged on. The conflict seemed as if there was no end in sight to it. In hyperspace, the 2 Jedi sat silently. They could feel it. Plagueis had no reason to believe that this was Palpatine's doing, and so he silently sat there, believing that the Sith had done this to themselves. Palpatine was all too humbled by his plan actually working as well as it did. And so as the dawn arose on Ahch-To, as did it rise across the galaxy. Palpatine's plan was about to bring a new era of light to the galaxy, but it relied on the 2 Jedi's ability to survive this final encounter with the Sith. Inside the throne room, Plo was thrown from his feet by Windu, and before Windu went in for the kill, he turned around and struck at Dooku, telling him that if anyone would become the Grand Lord of the Sith, it would be him. Korriban was a homeworld of the Sith, and forever shall it be. Yoda snarled back at Windu before leaping at him and dancing between Dooku and Windu. While Windu was focusing on his vicious attack on Dooku, Yoda forgot all about Plo, who rose up from behind him, slamming his lightsaber into Windu's back and kicking him to the ground. Dooku saw Plo, but didn't see him coming this quickly, as he doubled back and allowed Yoda to bounce off of Dooku's lightsaber and swing for Plo. Dooku kept his distance as he watched the 2 Sith toil with each other. Plo and Yoda were so evenly matched it was almost impossible that this fight could even come to an end. And then Plo took a slight advantage, cutting off Yoda's arm and then using the momentum to thrust his blade through Yoda. Before Plo could remotely enjoy his victory over Yoda and claim the throne for himself, Dooku spun around, cutting through the remnants of Yoda's body before slicing into Plo's chest, killing the Sith Lord immediately. Dooku looked around the room and acknowledged the dead, before turning and abandoning the temple. In the bottom of the temple, battle ensued. It was a tight and tense battle. There were hundreds of Sith left in the galaxy, 10,000 down to only hundreds, and they were all located here at the base of the temple, fighting for their right to power, fighting for the ability to take control of the Sith and the galaxy. When the 2 Jedi landed, they saw the ship Dooku used to vanish into hyperspace. The last Sith Lord, no longer a Sith Lord. Plagueis and Palpatine snuck into the temple, and they watched. The Great Hall of what used to be a Jedi temple thousands of years ago was filled with bodies, and amongst those bodies, the few hundred remaining Sith tearing each other apart. It was rather poetic that those with power cannot attain said power. They fought each other and tore each other down, and while those who were in minority would never stand a chance against them in bulk, they would stand a chance against them divided. The Sith killed each other, and the 2 Jedi watched. It was chaos. After hours of fighting, the Sith wore themselves down, and there were only a few left, still fighting, still trying to kill each other. One of those Sith being a master named Quinlan Vos. He was able to survive by his maneuverability. Another Sith master was still alive named Qui-Gon Jinn. The only reason he was still alive, though, is because he threw his student Obi-Wan Kenobi into a lightsaber so that he could prevail victorious. The other Sith were simple marauders, and they were so worn from combat they collapsed under the strength of the 2 Sith masters who fought against them. Palpatine and Plagueis made their way down, and as the fighting began to die out, they heard the ignition of 2 lightsabers. When the remaining Sith looked over, they saw 2 Jedi and couldn't believe their eyes. Jin and Vos realized that at the end of the day, they had each other a common enemy, still none the wiser to the fact that the Jedi committed such a heinous act against the Sith. The Jedi ran in, still not warriors that the Sith were, but having all the more energy than the Sith did. The lightsaber duel began and the four engaged each other in a tense matchup of skill. It was a battle for the galaxy, and the heart and soul of the galaxy depended on the Jedi being able to win this battle. Plagueis struck forward, getting engaged in tense combat with Jyn, who used the dark side to parry and beat back every strike made against him. Palpatine, on the other hand, used his speed to his advantage, though Voss had enough of him being so quick on his speed before using the Force to shoot lightning at Palpatine, stunting his attack, and then cutting through his left arm and using the Force to shoot him across the Great Hall into a pillar. Plagueis cried out Palpatine's name as he watched Palpatine fall to the ground in almost a lifeless demeanor. Plagueis held his ground, moving in between Jyn and Voss, trying to be the master he was supposed to be, and possibly save the galaxy. In his mind, if Palpatine was dead, then he was the final hope for the galaxy that needed change. Plagueis struck forward, missing Jyn, before doubling back and attacking Voss. The duo was quick, before Qui-Gon used electricity and shot it at Plagueis, who couldn't do anything but block the strike. Palpatine looked up, emerging from the sea of dead bodies and the fire that cascaded around him. He watched as his master fought rigorously to defend himself before Plagueis was cut down, like the rest of the Sith, dead inside the Great Hall. Palpatine's jaw dropped as he looked down to his missing arm. He closed his eyes and spoke the words to himself. "I am one with the Force, and the Force is with me." Palpatine stood up, pulling his lightsaber to his hand with the Force and saying, "I am one with the Force, and the Force is with me." Palpatine ignited the weapon, saying once more, "I am one with the Force, and the Force is with me." Palpatine opened his eyes and chanted the phrase, "I am one with the Force, and the Force is with me." The two Sith rushed Palpatine, and he lowered himself, moving the blade around to the center of his body before leaping forward and spinning as he did, cutting directly through Quinlan, dropping the Sith Lord into two separate pieces. Palpatine turned around and Qui-Gon was already swinging towards him. Palpatine used his flexibility to lean back under the swing before leaping backwards and doing a backflip. Palpatine watched Jyn swing aggressively, being very speedy with each and every strike as he leveraged his blade forward, but giving up a very important balance in each strike. Palpatine saw this, moving back and smacking each strike in a different direction. He saw his advantage as he pushed Jyn's blade into the ground. Palpatine spun around, cutting down, slicing off Jyn's dominant hand, before dragging his blade up and driving it forward into Jyn's chest. Palpatine looked around, realizing that there was peace, but first he ran over to his master. Plagueis was no longer alive, but Plagueis was alive long enough to see his student rise from what looked to be death, and keep the hope in the galaxy alive. The last thing that Plagueis saw was Palpatine saying the chant and igniting his lightsaber. In his last moments, he died as a proud teacher to the Jedi who would resurrect a lost order. In nearly 48 hours, the entirety of the Sith Order was wiped from the galaxy, all done by themselves. Palpatine couldn't ignite a flame in what would become a government, but he would send a message to the people of the galaxy from the Sith Temple. Palpatine would send his message with himself being shown, telling the people of the galaxy that he was the last Jedi, and the Sith were gone. The hope that loomed on the horizon was finally here. The darkest parts of the night always came before the day, and now it was time for the people of the galaxy to see the day, after 3,000 years of darkness. Palpatine told them that they must remember not to follow and fall into folly, greed, or failure. Instead, they must follow the path of happiness, community, governance, and forego the way of the Sith. Palpatine told the galaxy that as a Jedi, it was not his role to become their leader or their master. Instead, it was his role to inspire peace and give the galaxy room to breathe. Now that he had done so, he was going to burn all the Sith temples and outposts across the galaxy and allow the galaxy to converge together. Maybe a new republic would arise, or maybe another system of functional democracy, but all that mattered was the night was no longer here, and whatever would occur in the galaxy was up to the people after generations of dismay. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story. Again, special thanks to Benjamin Wells, Jonathan, Pimp Daddy, Bane, Darth, Cheesy, Apollo, Mad Money Studios, Anakin003, and Flynn Van Cease for supporting the channel. If you want to see a what if, let me know below or read off your comments, but I don't do crossovers. Check out the Twitch community, Discord, and Patreon to support me in other ways. If you want to win a free lightsaber, go down below. Hit that subscribe button. We're almost at 50,000 subscribers, so the last chance to get a lightsaber is coming soon. Go to the doc that's in the pinned comment below. Write your name on the doc. That's all you have to do. And let's talk about our story. So, I know what I'm going to get. Where's Anakin? He's not born. He's just simply not born. Why? Well, there's two reasons for that. In story, Plagueis isn't messing with the Force. Now, is that me saying that the Sith don't mess around with the Force? No, I'm saying the Sith can totally do that, but Anakin isn't a result of that. I'm saying that Anakin is a result of Plagueis and Palpatine messing with the Force, and as Jedi, they're not doing that. So one, that's why he's not in the story, and two, because the story yesterday revolved around Anakin, I didn't want to do another Anakin story, or a story that revolved on him. He's a little bit of an ex machina, and if you know what that is, it's basically an unbeatable character. He's just someone that literally is like, when you see him show up, most of you assume that he's not going to die. Now, sometimes I do kill him, but in a story like this, you would assume that he doesn't die. And the entire purpose of this story is that I'm suggesting that it's supposed to be a high-stakes story. The entire story is meant to feel like a high-stakes story, and I really hope that I was able to accomplish that. I wanted it to feel like everything was high-stakes in this story. So, again, maybe the Sith mess with the Force, but they don't create Anakin. They might create their own beings, but not Anakin. And the truth is, this story is like poetry. It just rhymes. Yeah, I know. George said that, and I'm saying it, because Yoda is a great failure, yet again, and Palpatine has the vision to go to distance. And that's kind of the point. The point is that while I think in a galaxy like this, there is the opportunity for hope. And again, back to the deeper message that I always try and implant in every story. This is a situation that is very gloomy. It's very, uninspiring, and it's supposed to be that way. But I'm also supposed to inspire you. That's, again, every story has a message embedded in it. And the story of this message is that even in the darkest days, there's always hope. That even when it doesn't look like you can succeed, you can always succeed. And that, I know, is pretty much true to the story of Star Wars, but that's also something that I wanted to embed in the story as hope for anyone that might be struggling. You know, all the darkest days do eventually come to an end. You know, there's always a glimmer of something there. If you look to the moon when there's no moon, it's still there. You can still find the shadow. You just have to see it. You just have to see that there's something there. And that's kind of the bigger message behind this. Again, finding the positivity in times that don't necessarily warrant it. So more so into the story itself. I made Palpatine weak, and that's the point. The Jedi aren't supposed to be powerful, and I'm used Palpatine as this very intelligent character, and I believe he'd be an intelligent Jedi, and that's something that I also played with in what is essentially a nature versus nurture video, with Palpatine being a Jedi. The video I did probably in June or July. But the video challenges what Palpatine would be as a Jedi, and I think he'd be an incredible Jedi. And that's something I wanted to challenge. You know, the Sith are warriors. They're meant to be warriors. They're supposed to focus on that, warrior code. And I think Palpatine would be significantly weaker if he wasn't trained as a Sith. I think he would be significantly weaker, but he would still have that really good connection to the Force, which would allow him to be, him. And that's kind of what I wanted to focus on, is Palpatine being Palpatine without being himself an ex machina, not being someone that can just walk in and kill everybody. I wanted all the stakes to be very high, and I wanted to feel like that maybe the good guys wouldn't win. And that's kind of what I wanted to go for, you know. Would the Sith tear each other down that fast? Probably. I don't put it past them. You know how I feel about Mandalore, and I kind of see the Sith in the same light. I don't think they're all dumb. I think Palpatine's a genius, but the rule of two functions for a reason, because the Sith live in spite of themselves. And that's kind of also the moral of the story, is that the Sith, or people with greed, kind of live inside of them, in spite of themselves, sorry. They kind of operate in a way that just makes them dysfunctional. And that, again, is another deeper layer to the story, is that, if you operate in this way, you're dysfunctional to yourself. You're only hurting yourself. You're not really making, yourself better. You're not making the world a better place. So you're really kind of just hurting everything. You're upsetting the cosmic balance, as it were. So, anyways, I hope you all enjoyed the story. I hope you enjoyed my little discussion at the end. And if you want to win that free lightsaber, go do the thing. We're almost there. We're literally so close. We are so close to 50,000 subscribers. I'm so excited to give these lightsabers away. And I got a new announcement coming out when we hit 50,000. So the next video might be huge. Or the video that comes out on Saturday might be huge. I don't know. But we'll find out when we find out. Anyways, I love you all. Spread the love. And always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.